June 4, 1942. At first, it looked like nothing more than a routine pursuit. One enemy force fleeing, another chasing. No grand strategy, no carefully written doctrine. Just speed, instinct, and the belief that pressure alone could break the enemy. But World War II had a way of turning simple decisions into irreversible disasters. On that morning in June 1942, commanders on both sides believed they were reacting to the moment. What they did not realize, what they could not yet see, was that this single chase would quietly evolve into one of the deadliest military tactics ever refined during the war. A tactic that would later be studied, copied, and feared. A tactic born not from brilliance, but from momentum, miscalculation, and human instinct. This is not the story of a perfectly planned maneuver. This is the story of how chasing an enemy too aggressively, without fully understanding the battlefield, created a killing method that reshaped modern warfare. In the early years of World War II, military thinking was still deeply rooted in older traditions. Commanders believed in pursuit. When an enemy retreated, you followed. When they broke formation, you pressed harder. The logic was simple. A running enemy is a defeated enemy. For centuries, this belief had been true. But the battlefields of World War II were no longer flat fields or predictable fronts. They were layered with air power, hidden reserves, long-range artillery, and rapid communication. Yet human psychology had not changed. When soldiers saw an enemy pulling back, adrenaline replaced caution. Orders became faster. Reconnaissance was delayed, and commanders, hungry for decisive victories, often mistook movement for collapse. This is where the danger began. During the war, many of the most devastating tactical disasters did not begin with overwhelming enemy strength. They began with confidence, with the belief that the enemy was weaker, slower, or already broken. A simple chase encouraged units to stretch themselves forward, thinning their lines, exposing their flanks, and abandoning defensive coordination. And the enemy learned to exploit this. What began as retreat became bait. What looked like fear was often patience. What seemed like victory was the opening move of a trap. One of the earliest realizations came when advancing. Units pushed beyond their supply lines. Fuel ran low, ammunition thinned, radio communication weakened. Infantry moved ahead of armor moved ahead of air cover. Every step forward increased vulnerability. But the momentum of the chase made stopping feel like failure. The enemy understood this psychology perfectly. Instead of holding ground, they gave it up. Instead of resisting, they withdrew, slowly, deliberately, leaving just enough resistance to keep the chase alive. Each kilometer forward pulled the pursuing force deeper into exposure, deeper into isolation. By the time the counterstrike came, it was already too late. Air power played a crucial role in transforming this chase into a deadly tactic. As pursuing forces advanced, they often did so under the assumption that the skies were either secure or irrelevant. But WE2 proved that air superiority could turn movement into massacre. Columns on the move were visible, predictable, vulnerable. Once the enemy identified the axis of advance, aircraft could strike supply trucks, fuel convoys, and communication vehicles. Roads became killing corridors. Retreat routes vanished. What had been a confident chase turned into chaos within minutes. Men were no longer advancing. They were trapped in motion. This is where the tactic truly formed. The enemy no longer needed to defeat the pursuer head-on. All they had to do was let them move forward and then seal the exits. Artillery fire blocked roads behind them. Infantry units appeared on the flanks. Armor emerged where it was least expected. And suddenly, the chasing force found itself surrounded, exhausted and out of position. Encirclement was no longer accidental. It was engineered. The chase itself became the weapon. What made this tactic so deadly was not just the physical destruction, but the psychological collapse it caused. Soldiers who believed they were winning suddenly realized they had no way out. Orders became confused. Units fired blindly. Coordination disappeared. Panic spread faster than gunfire. In many cases, resistance collapsed not because of casualties, but because hope vanished. The enemy did not need to kill everyone. They only needed to close the circle. As the war progressed, this method appeared again and again, on different fronts, with different armies, under different flags. The details changed, but the core principle remained the same. Invite the enemy forward, stretch them thin, then strike where they least expect it. Commanders who failed to recognize this pattern paid heavily. Those who learned it turned the tide of battles. By the mid-war years, this once accidental outcome became deliberate doctrine. Military planners began designing retreats that were not retreats at all, but calculated withdrawals. Maps were marked not with defensive lines, but with future encirclement zones. Every kilometer given up was a step toward annihilation. The chase was no longer spontaneous. It was scripted, and the battlefield became a stage where impatience was punished with destruction. What makes this tactic terrifying is how natural it feels. Even today, the instinct to pursue remains deeply embedded in military thinking. Victory feels closer when the enemy is moving away. Stopping feels like weakness. Waiting feels like failure. World War II proved the opposite. Sometimes the most dangerous moment in war is when you believe you are winning. The most lethal version of this tactic emerged when commanders began synchronizing time instead of terrain. Rather than focusing only on where the enemy would advance, planners focused on when. In this case, accelerated destruction. World War II revealed a cruel paradox. Sometimes doing everything right leads you exactly where the enemy wants you. As the encirclement tightened, battles became smaller but more desperate. Isolated pockets fought fiercely, unaware of the larger collapse. Officers attempted breakouts with fragments of their original units. Some succeeded temporarily, only to collide with secondary blocking forces designed precisely for that purpose. Each failed escape reinforced the sense that the battlefield itself had turned hostile. The enemy no longer needed to pursue. The environment did the killing. This tactic reshaped how future commanders thought about victory. No longer was success measured by how fast ground was taken, but by how effectively the enemy's options were reduced. Movement became a liability. Speed required justification, and the chase, once celebrated as decisive action, was now understood as something to be questioned, controlled, and, when necessary, resisted. But during World War II, many learned this lesson only after it destroyed them. The most haunting aspect of this tactic is its simplicity. It does not rely on superior numbers. It does not demand perfect coordination. It requires only patience, understanding of human behavior, and the discipline to let the enemy make the mistake themselves, a mistake born from instinct, from confidence, from the belief that retreat means weakness. The chase did not fail because it was foolish. It failed because it was predictable. And predictability, in war, is the deadliest weakness of all. As the war dragged on, this tactic began influencing decisions far beyond the battlefield. Entire campaigns were shaped around the expectation that the enemy would chase. Strategic withdrawals were no longer signs of weakness, but calculated invitations. Commanders accepted temporary political backlash, loss of territory, and public criticism, because they understood a deeper truth. Land could be reclaimed, but a destroyed enemy army could not be replaced quickly. The chase allowed short-term humiliation in exchange for long-term annihilation. This required an unusual kind of discipline. Leaders had to resist the urge to defend every inch of ground. They had to silence officers demanding immediate counterattacks. They had to trust that giving ground now would deliver something far more decisive later. Not all commanders possessed this restraint. Those who did turned the enemy's aggression into a weapon against itself. At the operational level, the battlefield was reshaped to reward overextension. Infrastructure was sabotaged in advance, not randomly, but selectively. Roads that appeared intact were left open intentionally, while alternative routes were quietly prepared for demolition. Fuel depots were evacuated just slowly enough to appear abandoned in haste. Maps captured by advancing forces were outdated by design, every detail reinforced. World War II showed that momentum without control is not strength. It is exposure. Entire divisions were neutralized not by superior firepower, but by superior patience. The enemy waited, absorbed losses, surrendered territory, and then reclaimed everything in a single overwhelming motion. What appeared to be retreat was, in truth, preparation. As this method repeated across campaigns, its reputation grew. Units that recognized the signs: empty roads, abandoned equipment, uneven resistance, sometimes tried to halt their advance. But stopping a chase once it has begun is one of the hardest decisions in warfare. To pause feels like admitting error. To pull back feels like surrendering initiative. And so many continued forward, straight into destruction. The true brilliance and cruelty of this tactic was that it required the enemy to defeat themselves. Every step forward was voluntary. Every kilometer gained increased the effectiveness of the trap. The defending force simply shaped the environment and waited for instinct to do the rest. War manuals would later describe this as operational encirclement. Historians would analyze it as maneuver warfare. But the soldiers who experienced it knew it by a simpler truth. They were never chasing the enemy. They were being led. This pattern reached its most lethal form when multiple branches of warfare were synchronized: ground forces fixing the enemy in place, air power sealing movement, and artillery delivering relentless pressure. Escape routes vanished, not because they were blocked by walls, but because they were covered by fire. Survival became a matter of minutes, not miles. And by the time the trapped forces understood what had happened, the tactic had already succeeded. The chase, once seen as courage, had become a liability. Speed, once praised, had become a weakness. Aggression, once celebrated, had become predictable. World War II did not just reveal this tactic, it perfected it. And the cost was measured not in lost ground but in entire armies erased from the map. As this tactic matured, commanders began to understand that geography alone was not enough. Terrain could slow an enemy, but expectation could destroy them. The most successful executions relied on shaping what the pursuer believed was happening. Intelligence leaks, visible withdrawals, abandoned equipment, even deliberate radio chatter were used to reinforce the illusion of panic. The enemy was not just retreating physically, they were retreating psychologically. And psychology, once compromised, was easier to exploit than any defensive line. The chasing force began to interpret every sign through the lens of victory. Broken bridges were seen as desperation, not preparation. Scattered units were assumed to be stragglers, not screens. Silence was mistaken for collapse, not concealment. Each assumption narrowed their thinking, making alternative interpretations feel unnecessary. By the time doubts surfaced, those doubts arrived alone, unsupported, and too late to alter the course already set in motion. One of the most devastating refinements of this tactic was the deliberate manipulation of pace. The retreating force did not move too fast nor too slow. Too fast would arouse suspicion. Too slow would invite consolidation. Instead, they maintained a tempo that matched the pursuer's confidence. Fast enough to feel rewarding, slow enough to feel controllable. This pacing ensured that the chasing force never paused long enough to reassess the larger picture. War is not only fought with weapons, it is fought with timing, and timing, once controlled, becomes dominance. As the pursuit deepened, the attacking force often reorganized itself, subconsciously for offense rather than survival. Defensive formations loosened. Flank security was reduced. Reconnaissance units were pushed forward aggressively, sometimes beyond the ability to support them. Reserves were committed early to maintain momentum. Every decision made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a structure that could not withstand sudden reversal. When the counterstroke came, it did not feel like an attack. It felt like reality collapsing. Another critical layer of this tactic was denial rather than destruction. Instead of annihilating advancing units outright, the encircling force focused on denying choices. Roads were not merely blocked. They were rendered unusable by overlapping fire. Open ground was not defended. It was observed and punished. Forests were not cleared. They were watched. Escape became theoretically possible but practically suicidal. This distinction mattered. Soldiers can endure loss. What they cannot endure is the certainty that every option leads to the same end. Weather and exhaustion amplified the effectiveness of the trap. Long pursuits drained men faster than battles ever could. Sleep disappeared. Hunger set in. Equipment failed under constant movement. Vehicles broke down and were abandoned. Discipline weakened not because soldiers lacked courage, but because their bodies could no longer support sustained alertness. When encirclement occurred under these conditions, resistance fragmented instantly. Fatigue does not announce itself. It simply removes the ability to adapt. By the time High Command attempted to intervene, the situation had already slipped beyond control. Maps showed units where they no longer existed. Reports contradicted each other. Requests for air support arrived after airfields had been lost. Reinforcements moved toward positions that had already fallen. The speed of the chase had outpaced the speed of understanding. In war, this delay is fatal. What made this tactic especially unforgiving was that it punished competence as harshly as recklessness. Well-trained units advanced efficiently, covering more ground faster, and therefore entered deeper into the trap. Poorly coordinated forces sometimes survived simply because they moved slower. Skill, in this case, accelerated destruction. World War II revealed a cruel paradox. Sometimes doing everything right leads you exactly where the enemy wants you. As the encirclement tightened, battles became smaller but more desperate. Isolated pockets fought fiercely, unaware of the larger collapse. Officers attempted breakouts with fragments of their original units. Some succeeded temporarily, only to collide with secondary blocking forces designed precisely for that purpose. Each failed escape reinforced the sense that the battlefield itself had turned hostile. The enemy no longer needed to pursue. The environment did the killing. This tactic reshaped how future commanders thought about victory. No longer was success measured by how fast ground was taken, but by how effectively the enemy's options were reduced. Movement became a liability. Speed required justification, and the chase, once celebrated as decisive action, was now understood as something to be questioned, controlled, and, when necessary, resisted. But during World War II, many learned this lesson only after it destroyed them. The most haunting aspect of this tactic is its simplicity. It does not rely on superior numbers. It does not demand perfect coordination. It requires only patience, understanding of human behavior, and the discipline to let the enemy make the mistake themselves, a mistake born from instinct, from confidence, from the belief that retreat means weakness. The chase did not fail because it was foolish. It failed because it was predictable. And predictability, in war, is the deadliest weakness of all. As the war dragged on, this tactic began influencing decisions far beyond the battlefield. Entire campaigns were shaped around the expectation that the enemy would chase. Strategic withdrawals were no longer signs of weakness, but calculated invitations. Commanders accepted temporary political backlash, loss of territory, and public criticism, because they understood a deeper truth. Land could be reclaimed, but a destroyed enemy army could not be replaced quickly. The chase allowed short-term humiliation in exchange for long-term annihilation. This required an unusual kind of discipline. Leaders had to resist the urge to defend every inch of ground. They had to silence officers demanding immediate counterattacks. They had to trust that giving ground now would deliver something far more decisive later. Not all commanders possessed this restraint. Those who did turned the enemy's aggression into a weapon against itself. At the operational level, the battlefield was reshaped to reward overextension. Infrastructure was sabotaged in advance, not randomly, but selectively. Roads that appeared intact were left open intentionally, while alternative routes were quietly prepared for demolition. Fuel depots were evacuated just slowly enough to appear abandoned in haste. Maps captured by advancing forces were outdated by design, every detail reinforced the illusion that the retreat was chaotic, improvised, and desperate. In reality, it was none of those things. The chasing forces often believed they were forcing the enemy into a final stand. Intelligence reports echoed what commanders wanted to hear. Prisoners spoke of shortages. Recon flights showed movement away from the front. The narrative of collapse became self-sustaining. Once belief set in, evidence to the contrary was dismissed as anomaly rather than warning. This is how traps succeed in war, not by hiding the truth completely, but by making the lie more comfortable. When encirclement finally locked into place, it rarely happened in a single moment. It unfolded in stages. First came uncertainty, then isolation, then realization. Units noticed enemy fire coming from unexpected directions. Supply convoys failed to arrive. Orders contradicted each other. Maps no longer matched reality. The sense of direction, both physical and strategic, evaporated. At that point, even escape became part of the enemy's design. Breakout attempts were anticipated and shaped. Corridors were left intentionally thin, drawing desperate forces into zones of concentrated fire. Night movements were observed and struck at dawn. Forest paths were mined just enough to slow, not stop, movement, maximizing confusion and casualties. The enemy did not need to block every route. They only needed to control the outcome of each attempt. Hope itself was weaponized. As resistance weakened, the psychological toll became irreversible. Soldiers began to understand that the chase, the moment they felt most confident, had been the beginning of the end. Survivors would later describe the same haunting realization. There was no single mistake, no clear turning point. The disaster emerged gradually, quietly, until escape was no longer a question of skill or bravery, but of chance. And chance was already exhausted. This tactic left a lasting scar on military thinking because it inverted traditional values. Initiative became dangerous. Aggression became exploitable. Speed became suspect. World War II forced armies to confront the idea that control mattered more than momentum, and that sometimes the enemy advancing fastest was the one closest to defeat. The battlefield rewarded patience, not courage alone. Even after the fighting ended, the lessons of this tactic echoed into future conflicts. Training manuals warned against uncontrolled pursuit. Officers were taught to question success that came too easily. Reconnaissance, logistics, and communication were elevated to the same importance as firepower. The chase was no longer forbidden, but it was no longer trusted. Because history had shown what it could become. What makes this story unsettling is how easily it repeats. The conditions that created this tactic, confidence, urgency, desire for decisive victory, exist in every war. Technology changes, weapons evolve, but human instinct remains constant. The urge to pursue a retreating enemy feels natural, logical, and emotionally satisfying, which is exactly why it is so dangerous. The deadliest tactics are not the most complex ones. They are the ones that rely on behavior you cannot turn off. And this one relied on something timeless. The belief that an enemy running away is already defeated. As this tactic repeated itself across fronts and years, its true power revealed itself not in single battles but in patterns of collapse. Entire formations disappeared in ways that seemed illogical on paper. Commanders reviewing maps after the fact struggled to pinpoint where defeat had actually begun. There was no dramatic breach, no overwhelming frontal assault. Instead, destruction arrived through accumulation of small decisions, small advances, small assumptions that stacked silently until the structure could no longer hold. War rarely ends armies with one blow. It ends them by convincing them to keep moving. One of the most overlooked elements was silence. The retreating force learned when not to fight. Silence denied the pursuer feedback. Without resistance, advancing units had nothing to measure against. No clear enemy line, no definitive engagement, just empty ground and unanswered questions. Silence created momentum by removing friction, and momentum carried the enemy forward faster than orders ever could. In this quiet, uncertainty grew, but confidence grew faster. As the chase deepened, logistics transformed from support into vulnerability. Supply convoys stretched thin over long distances, exposed to terrain they had never planned to defend. Each additional kilometer multiplied the effort required to sustain the advance. Fuel consumption rose, maintenance schedules collapsed. Small mechanical failures turned into strategic problems. Vehicles abandoned on roads became obstacles, signals of strain that commanders tried desperately to ignore. The chase demanded perfection. The battlefield punished inevitability. What made the tactic especially lethal was that it scaled effortlessly. It worked against small units and massive armies alike, against mechanized forces and infantry columns, against experienced commanders and inexperienced ones. Its effectiveness did not depend on numbers, but on behavioral predictability. If an enemy believed retreat meant weakness, the trap was already halfway complete. This universality is what made it so devastating. Time itself became a weapon. The longer the chase continued, the more irreversible the outcome became. Even when doubts emerged, turning back required admitting failure, reorganizing under pressure, and surrendering initiative, all actions that felt worse than pressing forward. So forward became the only acceptable option, even when it was clearly dangerous. At that point, destruction was no longer imposed. It was chosen. Inside the encirclement, survival shifted from strategy to instinct. Units fought not for objectives, but for water, shelter, and direction. Maps were torn, burned, or useless. Leadership fragmented as officers were killed or separated. Rank lost meaning. Only proximity mattered. The battlefield dissolved into isolated struggles disconnected from any larger purpose. War had narrowed to moments. Attempts to restore order often made things worse. Counterattacks launched without coordination burned remaining fuel. Breakouts attempted without reconnaissance collided with prepared defenses. Airdrops missed their targets or fell into enemy hands. Each effort to escape tightened the psychological grip of the trap, reinforcing the sense that the enemy controlled not just the terrain, but the future. Control is the true currency of war. This tactic succeeded because it denied the enemy the ability to reset. There was no pause, no clean break, no opportunity to re-establish balance. Movement replaced planning, reaction replaced decision-making, and eventually, exhaustion replaced resistance. By the time surrender became an option, it no longer felt like defeat. It felt like relief. In hindsight, historians would debate whether the outcome could have been avoided. They would analyze maps, timelines, and orders. They would identify moments where caution might have saved lives. But those moments existed only briefly, and only for those willing to question success itself. Most were not. The chase did not turn deadly because it was reckless. It turned deadly because it felt right, and that is why it worked. As more armies fell into this pattern, a disturbing realization surfaced among those who studied the wreckage afterward. The tactic did not require deception to be perfect. It only needed the enemy to cooperate just enough. Even when retreating forces made mistakes, misjudged timing, exposed flanks, incomplete withdrawals, the chase compensated for those flaws. The pursuers' urgency erased their own margin for correction. Errors on one side were absorbed by impatience on the other. This imbalance made the tactic brutally forgiving for the defender and mercilessly unforgiving for the attacker. Another layer of lethality came from fragmentation. Large advancing formations rarely remained intact during prolonged pursuit. Units diverged to seize opportunities, secure villages, or capture perceived escape routes. What began as coordinated movement slowly dissolved into parallel advances that could not support each other quickly. When the counterstrike arrived, it did not need to defeat a unified force. It faced pieces, each convinced they were part of a larger success that no longer existed. Fragmentation does not look like defeat. It looks like initiative. Night operations further magnified the danger. Advancing forces used darkness to maintain momentum, believing it reduced vulnerability. But night erased landmarks, distorted distances, and weakened command control. The retreating force exploited this by allowing movement at night and striking at dawn. When confusion peaked and fatigue was absolute, the enemy awoke not to battle but to realization. Morning revealed the trap. As the encirclement tightened, the concept of the front line vanished. Attacks came from directions that maps had never prepared for. Rear areas became combat zones. Command posts became targets. Supply depots became battlegrounds. Soldiers trained to face forward discovered that war had wrapped around them. Orientation was lost before resistance ended. The psychological damage inflicted by this tactic often outlasted the physical destruction. Survivors carried a permanent distrust of apparent success. Veterans later described a lingering fear of empty ground and quiet roads. Advancement without resistance no longer felt like victory. It felt like warning. World War II reshaped not just doctrines but instincts. Confidence itself became suspect. This tactic also altered how commanders valued information. Reports that once signaled opportunity were now questioned aggressively. Speed was measured against sustainability. Aggression was weighed against exposure. The chase, once a symbol of dominance, required justification at every level. Armies that adapted survived. Those that clung to old assumptions repeated the same. Disaster in different locations. Adaptation was no longer optional. Yet even as knowledge spread, the tactic continued to claim victims. Why? Because war compresses time. Decisions must be made before patterns fully reveal themselves. Commanders operate with partial information under pressure. Surrounded by momentum they did not create but must now control. Knowing a trap exists does not mean you can always avoid it, especially when avoiding it feels like surrendering victory. This is the cruel truth of warfare. What truly sealed the deadliness of this tactic was its ability to disguise itself as success until the very end. There was no clear alarm, no obvious moment to stop, just a continuous stream of small gains that masked a growing strategic collapse. By the time reality asserted itself, it did so violently, leaving no room for correction. The trap did not close suddenly. It simply finished closing. At its core, this tactic revealed something deeply uncomfortable, that war punishes certainty more than ignorance. Those who believed they understood the battlefield best were often the most exposed. Those who moved fastest were often the most vulnerable. And those who chased hardest were often the ones being hunted. World War II did not invent this truth. It proved it at an industrial scale. By the final years of World War II, this tactic was no longer an accident, nor merely a lesson learned too late. It had become a silent rule of survival. Commanders who lived long enough to understand it stopped asking how fast they could advance, and began asking how easily they could be lured. Victory was no longer measured in kilometers gained, but in traps avoided. The battlefield had taught them that movement without control was not progress, it was exposure. And that the most dangerous moment in any campaign was not when the enemy attacked, but when they stepped aside. This realization came at a terrible cost. Entire armies vanished not because they lacked courage or strength, but because they trusted a familiar instinct in an unfamiliar war. The chase had promised clarity in a conflict defined by uncertainty. It offered action instead of hesitation, motion instead of doubt. And that promise was irresistible. World War II punished that instinct relentlessly, turning confidence into collapse and speed into silence. The ground advanced over did not remember the victors. It remembered the missing. What makes this story endure is not the scale of destruction, but the simplicity of its beginning, a single decision to pursue, a belief that retreat meant weakness, a moment where stopping felt worse than moving forward. From that moment, the outcome no longer belonged to strategy alone, it belonged to human nature. World War II revealed that the deadliest tactics are not always born in war rooms or written into doctrine. Sometimes they emerge quietly, shaped by instinct, reinforced by success, and perfected by repetition. The chase did not kill because it was violent. It killed because it was convincing, and long after the guns fell silent, that lesson remained, etched into military history as a warning that in war, the enemy you pursue may already be deciding where you will fall. Thanks for watching.